All right, everybody, welcome back into another episode of Stadium Seat Sports. As always, I'm Coop here with my partner and co-host Kriv. And Kriv, in this one, we're going to do a recap video of the game, and we've got a lot to get into from this game. It was not the most exciting game from the score line, but there's just so much to talk about rather, excuse me, from this game and potential fallouts and outcomes for each program here. So I'm going to throw it over to you to get us started on just recapping the game in general, and then we'll move on to some other topics here as well.
Yeah, so I think we kind of talked about this before the game, and I don't think we thought it would actually play out this way. But the one thing we did call out was the interior defense of Michigan and
Yep.
Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, first round talents. I mean, Mason Graham's probably a top 10 talent. And we said if they can disrupt the game, then they can win.
Yep.
And for whatever reason, Ohio State made it a point to run the ball directly
Mhm.
at them. And it's one of the most baffling, I guess, game plans we've seen to date.
Yeah.
Michigan's secondary depleted. Um, and for whatever reason, Ryan Day, Chip Kelly decided we're going to run it into the teeth of the defense, where they have the best players on their line and we have the worst.
Yeah.
It's honestly baffling, and
It's
it's
mind-boggling,
yeah,
truly.
yeah. And I saw the stat, and it was they ran it 14 times directly up the middle, and they had 35 yards,
Yep.
2.5 yards a carry. And you'd think after just a few runs where you get stuffed over and over, you try something new. And
Right.
honestly, there were a few plays where the run game worked, and it was when there's one play I remember where Will Howard had an option, so him and Travion jump outside.
Yeah.
Defender picks on Will Howard. Will Howard pitches it to Travion. He gets like 15 yards, or maybe it was Judkins, one or the other.
Yeah. I think it
Um,
was Henderson, but
yeah, so they do that one time, get a big chunk of yards, never do it again, and they ran to the outside away from Grant and Mason, and neither guy can make a play if you're running away from them.
yeah.
So there was some low-hanging fruit there. And the other thing, obviously, we just talked about the run game. They refused to pass the ball, and when they did pass the ball, it was short passes.
Yeah.
Um, and the only time they really took deep shots was to Jeremiah Smith, who, wow, they have no one that can defend him on Michigan.
Yeah.
And it was a defensive pass interference every single time.
Yep.
Maybe we weren't completing those passes, but we were getting 15 yards and an automatic first.
Yeah.
Sorry, when I say we, Ohio State.
Yeah.
Um, you're getting that automatic first. Why not just keep doing that until they prove they can stop it?
Yeah.
And you could see there were plenty of plays where Jeremiah, Emeka, Carnell Tate, they were all lined up on the outside, very clearly had man-on-man coverage. Michigan doesn't have the guys to do that without Will Johnson out there. And those same plays where they had that advantage, it was either a strange pass to a tight end for short
Yeah.
yardage, or it was another forced run. And for whatever reason, the only time we saw Ohio State look like the Ohio State everyone knows and respects was
Yeah.
when it was that 2 minute drill at the end of the second half where they had no choice but to pass downfield.
Yeah.
And when they were forced into that, they took off. So,
Yeah.
um,
I,
yeah, I'll kick things back over to you, but I mean, it's honestly baffling and shocking, and the score's the outcome of that because they blatantly went away from their strengths and played into Michigan's.
yeah. No, I mean, this game from an Ohio State fan's point of view was had to be one of the most frustrating games to watch in Ohio State football history. Like truthfully, and we'll get into Ryan Day here at the end of the video and the fallout from this game, which is kind of what I had mentioned in the introduction to this video of what additionally we're going to talk about. But man, for a lack of a better phrase, he and his coaching staff, mainly he and Chip Kelly, pissed down their legs in this
Yep.
game, and Ryan Day has for the past 4 years. Like the game plan from the Ohio State perspective was so poor. It all of this seems mental to me. when it comes to Ryan Day because they were so hellbound on, or hellbent rather, on running the football into the strength of that Michigan defense. Like you mentioned, the interior defensive line, just to prove a point that they are a tough football team. When in reality, you can still be tough and utilize the unbelievable skill players you have on the outside and take advantage of the advantages you have over that Michigan defense. I mean, for goodness sakes, they didn't have Will Johnson, their best cornerback, one of the better cornerbacks, if not the best cornerback in all of college football, going to be a first round pick coming up in this NFL draft. Like, why would you not throw the football a vast majority of the time? And I saw this quote, and I want to believe it was a real quote that like Ryan Day had said, it was windy that day. We needed to not get away from the run. My guy, the run wasn't working.
Well, and
Throw the football.
well, that too, and also the type of run plays weren't working. I
Correct.
mean,
I mean, how many times did they get inside the red zone and they ran a sweep to the short side of the field every time it was tackled in the backfield? At least 3 times in the red zone.
They'd either run it up the middle into the strength of the defense or run it to the short side of the field where typically you have a disadvantage. And it just didn't make sense. It's like
No.
there's no
And
creativity. Where was the against Indiana? We saw that wide receiver like reverse where they handed it off to Jeremiah Smith and he got like 25 yards against Indiana. Where
Yeah,
was that one time? There was
correct.
there's no zero creativity in
Did
this run
Jeremiah
game.
Smith have a target in the second half? I really don't think he did. He didn't have a catch.
If he did, there was maybe one, but it was like a short yardage like throwaway.
Like that alone is like a fireable offense in my mind.
Well,
Like
yeah,
that is unbelievable.
yeah, and we talked about it. I mean,
Unreal.
every time they threw it downfield to Jeremiah, it was a pass interference on the defense. And
Correct.
there was even one in the end zone where I don't know the corner's name for Michigan, but he committed pass interference in the end zone, saving a touchdown. And he looks over to the sideline and gives them a thumbs up. That was the
Right.
game plan. They're like, we're just not going to let you get a touchdown. We're going to give you pass interference all day, and
Correct.
we'll get in those short yardage situations, and you're going to play right into our hands. And that's exactly what they did.
Right.
And I think you made another good point. It was that one drive. I think it was after the Caleb Downs interception, 3rd and 8, and they ran a halfback draw.
Yeah.
And as soon as they did that,
Short side of the field. Field's already shrunk.
you,
Like,
you knew Ohio State. You knew Ohio State was losing because that was a loser play call.
yeah.
And it's baffling to me because I think, at least from a player perspective, I know obviously they missed the 2 field goals. Jaden Fielding's not a good kicker. He's a walk-on kicker. That's unacceptable for Ohio State to even
Correct.
have a guy of that talent.
Like you have a
But
$20 million roster, but you can't get a kicker is
exactly,
unacceptable.
exactly. And but when you run a halfback draw in that situation and you have probably 3 guys who are first-round talent at receiver, you're playing to lose.
Yeah.
That's what we've seen year after year. And I actually saw this really interesting stat. Ohio State's defense, which by the way, I thought they played relatively well.
Yeah, I did too.
That last drive where they couldn't stop Mullins was a backbreaker, but before that, they were in pretty good shape.
Yeah. The
It,
defense did enough to win that game.
yeah, Ohio State should score more than 13 points and win that game. But
But they scored 10.
yeah,
Michigan
yeah,
scored
exactly.
13.
Well, I'm
Yeah.
saying they have to score more than 13 to win that game.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah.
But the one thing I saw, and this pretty much I think defines Ryan Day's time at Ohio State, is they have not forced a Michigan punt in the fourth quarter since 2019.
Yeah.
2019. And
The
guess
game
what?
that he won.
The game that he
The one
won.
that he won.
And guess
Yep.
what? The only one that he won was a year removed from Urban Meyer, and it was an Urban Meyer culture and an Urban Meyer players.
Mhm.
And this time, I actually feel like the players played with enough intensity, the physicality. I mean, the run game wasn't there. This was strictly a coaching loss for Ohio State.
For sure.
And in the past, you could say the guys weren't tough enough, this and that. They were right where they needed to be. The offensive game plan was horrendous.
Yeah.
Uninspired. It's almost like they were so scared. They knew they had a talent advantage, and they didn't
Yeah.
want to squander it by making
They were
mistakes.
they were afraid
And
to use the talent advantage.
yeah,
Like, what's the point of having the talent advantage if you're not going to utilize it? Like,
yeah,
that is the biggest indictment on Ryan Day and Chip Kelly. And I think you touched on the game really well. You highlighted what Michigan did well, what Ohio State did not do well. Like, I think at this point, we kind of jump into the Ryan Day conversation because for me, truthfully, if you're an Ohio State fan, if you're an alumni, if you're a booster for Ohio State, that to me has to be the last straw. And I know he has a gigantic buyout, $37 million, aside from going on to win the national championship this year, because we both know Ohio State's going to be part of the 12-team college football playoff. They've got 2 losses, 2 top 5 wins. They will be in there. Question will be, will they be hosting a playoff game or will they be on the road for a first round playoff game?
And
But neither
real
one. Yeah, go ahead.
real quick before we completely move on to this coach talk here, there's one moment and one drive that I feel like kind of captures what Ryan Day does in these big games, especially Michigan. And that was that final drive after the Mullins run. I think they ran a play and there was like 2 minutes, 42 seconds left after that. If he calls a timeout right there,
Yeah,
um, then they can get the ball back at the 2 minute warning or just after it. But instead, he lets the clock run all the way down to the 2 minutes.
yeah. I
Then
mean,
they,
clock management's horrible.
yeah, yeah. And that was the whole point of him giving up play calling was so he could better manage the game while it's going on. And so if he used those timeouts early enough and in the correct manner, you're looking at Ohio State getting the football with 2 minutes left. And, obviously the offense did nothing with that 30 to 45 seconds, but with 2 minutes, you can do a little bit more and open things up. So,
Yeah,
huge missed opportunity there. But of course, he doesn't do that. Then it's 3rd and 2, uses a timeout, and then he sends 12 people on the field. And after the game, he says, "We panicked."
yeah. You
And
mean you panicked is what you're saying?
it is absolutely unacceptable and insane in that moment to not be able to get 11 people on the field after a timeout.
Yeah.
It's
I mean
it's
that
it's
that
on, it's honestly pathetic.
that's an
And
indictment on him and
yeah,
him alone.
and I know he's not the defensive coordinator, but you're the head coach. You have to make these kind of mistakes can't happen the last Saturday in November. Sure, this could
Correct.
happen against a subpar team, week 2 of the
Yeah.
season
This
and
happened against
whatever.
Marshall, third week of the year.
Yeah,
Okay.
not a problem. But yeah, so I think that really captures everything about the Ryan Day experience at Ohio State.
I
And
do
and
too.
going back to the coaching search, I know you were saying um, that you think it's time to move on, and I tend to agree. And let me just say this first, like everything I've heard, Ryan Day is a great guy, great family. This
Yeah.
just probably isn't the job for him.
Correct.
And
No one, I think, wishes ill upon him or anything like that. It's just when you're the head coach at Ohio State, right? No one cares about your 49-1 record against the rest of the Big Ten. You're 1-4 against Michigan. When you have the talent that you have at Ohio State, a mediocre to good coach can come in and win 850, 900 percentage wise of those games in the Big Ten because of the talent advantage that you have, right? You're measured at Ohio State by winning the game, Big Ten championships, and national championships. And in all of that regard, aside from 1 or 2 years, Ryan Day has failed. It's been
yeah,
an utter failure. It's 4 years in a row now for the game. And that's why I said in the beginning of this podcast, it seems mental to me. Like he mentally is just broken by this game.
yeah,
It's truly like he looks like a broken man in this game. And that's why I just don't see how you fix it. He's in his own way and he can't get out.
yeah. So in my opinion, and I agree. Last 4 years, no wins against Michigan, and you could argue that Michigan had those advantages from Connor Stallions or whatever you want to say.
Right. But not this
But
year.
last year it was already exposed, so you had a chance. This year they had no advantage. They
No,
had they had a depleted roster. Their Loveland didn't play, Will Johnson didn't play. I mean, there was no excuses this year. You're a 20-point favorite. You're at home, and you scored
this is
10
probably
points
one
and
of the
lay an egg.
like worst losses for Ohio State that I could ever remember.
Yeah.
Like watching, like if you're an Ohio State fan, like this has to be one of the worst losses in program history.
Yeah, I'll say this. So
Truly,
I think one, they're not. If Ohio State does something, it's not going to be until after the playoff, because
correct.
one, you have National Signing Day coming up here in 2 days, um, and then of course, you have the playoffs coming. Uh, if by some miracle he wins 4 games and wins a national championship, I mean, obviously, regardless of what's happened in the rivalry, you'd be hard pressed to remove a man who just won a national championship.
Correct. He'd
Uh,
stay.
but I'll say this, I don't Do I think Ohio State has the talent to do it? Yes. Do I
for
think
sure.
Ryan Day has the capability to do it? No. And
Yeah,
because
I agree.
and regardless of what we've seen, not counting the COVID season because that was a weird season, and I know we won that playoff game against Clemson. We haven't won a big game, a truly big game. I'm not counting Penn State because James Franklin loses every single time.
Yeah, I'm not counting
He,
Indiana either, to be
and
honest with you. Great
I'm not counting
story.
that. What's the last big win? And the last big win was probably 2019 against Michigan.
Yeah,
Um, and you can say, oh, the Big Ten championship, whatever. I mean, Michigan was the last time they won a big game. And you look at the last few years. I mean, yes, we beat Clemson in the playoff. There was no one in the stadium. Who knows? I mean, it was a great win, but who knows?
right.
Georgia, that was the Ryan Day that we thought he turned the page.
Yeah.
And
He's not been seen since.
Ohio State was like, okay, that's the guy we hired. That's the guy from the Urban Meyer era that took over the team, who was this aggressive guy. He has turtled completely since that game.
Yeah, that
And
that aggressive Ryan Day has not been seen since.
yeah, and that's the problem.
Hmm.
They 4 years, last 4 years, no Big Ten championships, no wins against Michigan, and no playoff wins. So
Yeah,
he's probably going to have most likely going to be Ohio State versus Tennessee. Just depends on who's going to be home or
correct.
away. But
Yep.
honestly, we Ohio State has shown over and over that when Ryan Day gets on this stage, he panics and he
Yeah.
doesn't. He for whatever reason, it's stuck in his head. He has to prove a point, and he doesn't play to his team's strengths. He's like, "We're going to run the ball. We're going to do this. We're going to do that." People say we're not tough, and he does it over and over.
Yeah.
And I was hoping it was interesting to see because Chip Kelly kind of fell into that same mindset. Maybe
Well,
this
Ryan
because
Day is a protege of Chip Kelly, so
yeah, exactly. So I think with that being said, these last few minutes here. I'm curious what you want to see as the next head coach if they were
yeah.
to go down that road. I'm not saying they are. Obviously, there's a path to Ryan Day staying, even if it's just a buyout amount or if it's the playoff performance, whatever you want to say. But let's say, theoretically speaking, Ohio State does decide to move on. What does your candidate list look like?
It's difficult, but you and I texted off air about this, and you had mentioned two guys, and I was thinking along the same lines. Like, I think it's time for Ohio State to bring back an Ohio State guy. It just seems like Ryan Day does not understand the nature of the rivalry of the game. Like, he says all the right things, but he never executes on those things that he talks about. So whether it's Marcus Freeman from Notre Dame, you mentioned that, and I think that he is a good candidate. I don't know if he would leave Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame, he's got them in a great place. I think that Notre Dame in and of itself is a phenomenal program. I know Ohio State would be coming home for him, so maybe he would listen. But you would have to throw the bag at him. So we talked about it. Like Ryan Day's buyout's $37 million. You mentioned you're probably in and around $50 million or so for the next head coach for Ohio State, contractually speaking. So you're looking at like $100 million essentially transaction, which is a significant investment to say the least. I'm not saying Ohio State's boosters wouldn't do so if it came down to it, but that's a very big ask. Next, you mentioned it when we were texting back and forth. Mike Vrabel is currently, with the Cleveland Browns. Like, he's an Ohio State guy. He's tough. He's gritty. He understands the rivalry. Like, those would be my two top candidates. Because when I look around the college football landscape, I don't know who else I'm taking because it's hard for me to say. Right, Ryan Day's record outside of the game and then in the postseason is very solid. But I mentioned it, like, you would expect that from pretty much any coach you bring into Ohio State because of the talent that you have year in and year out. But like outside of Kirby Smart, who's at Georgia, he's not going to leave Georgia. So it's like from the actual college football landscape, I really think it's like Marcus Freeman. I think Mike Vrabel. Outside of that, those would be my top two guys I'm calling.
Yeah.
If Ohio State decides to move on, I think it's time they bring back an Ohio State guy. I really do. There's just, again, I mentioned it. You are measured at Ohio State by winning the game, Big Ten championships, and national championships. This is the fourth year in a row that the Buckeyes will not find themselves in Indianapolis. As an Ohio State football fan, alumni, player, program, that's unacceptable. You not being in Indianapolis for the Big Ten championship 4 years in a row, you losing the game 4 years in a row, like that is an indictment on who Ryan Day is as a head coach at this point in his Ohio State career. Aside from going 49-1 against the rest of the Big Ten, which, hey, that's phenomenal. Kudos to you. You're not winning the games that you're supposed to. Like, you're supposed to win those games, not even a question mark. The
Yeah.
other games where I'm talking about, the Michigan game, Big Ten championship, national championship, where talent is relatively equal across all fronts, depending on what team you're facing, he fails in most of those games. And
Yep.
that's just Ohio State fans, alumni, boosters are not going to accept that. And you and I have talked about this before. Like, look back at the Urban Meyer era, right? They would drop the occasional game to Purdue, to Iowa, like to these teams that they shouldn't lose to. But Urban Meyer was 7-0 against Michigan. He
Yeah.
won a national championship. He won several Big Ten championships. You ask any Ohio State fan, hey, would you rather be 49-1 against the rest of the Big Ten, but be 1-4 against Michigan, have no Big Ten titles the last 4 years, and no national championships to show for it? Or would you take a random loss to Iowa, to Purdue, someone you should not lose to, but you're beating your rival every year, you're winning Big Ten titles consistently, and you're winning national championships?
Yeah.
We all know, every Ohio State football fan is saying, yep, give us Urban Meyer and that option.
So I want to track back to the coaching options.
Yeah.
And for me, I think Vrabel's obviously number one. And like you said, he's an Ohio guy, born and bred. He was an All-American at Ohio State, multiple Super Bowl winning player with the Patriots. He, of course, was very successful with the Titans. You can say, oh, well, his record is just slightly over 500. But if you watch what he did with those teams in Tennessee,
Yeah.
they were at a talent disadvantage a lot of the times,
Mm-hmm.
and he
It's fair
he
to say.
maximized their talent. And they were a game or two away from a Super Bowl multiple times. That's a high level coach.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of cheesy to say this, but Mike Vrabel is kind of like Michigan's Jim Harbaugh. Um, they
Sure. Uh,
both played at the schools, both successful in the NFL as a head coach. Vrabel obviously has said things in the past that would say he's kind of hesitant to be a college head coach because of what it entails with recruiting.
sure.
I think the changes to NIL since he's made those comments kind of opens things up a bit because
Yeah. Makes it more
it's
NFL-esque.
yeah, it's more free agency type. You can bring in a guy who can be that GM, so to speak, nowadays because it is free agency.
Mm-hmm.
There's obviously some recruiting, but you keep a strong recruiting staff around him. Probably keep the Ohio State coordinate or Ohio State coaches that play there. When I say that, I mean Laurinaitis and Hartline, probably the
Yep.
two best recruiters on each side of the ball.
Mm-hmm.
You'd imagine they'd want to stay with him, and I
Yeah.
think that would allow them to maintain their top recruits, their top current players, like Jeremiah Smith, if a change were to happen.
Mm-hmm.
You'd imagine Vrabel has a ton of NFL connections, and you bring in those NFL coaches, which
Sure.
we saw Michigan do that. They brought in NFL coaches, and that talent level from those coaches is hard for other colleges to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Vrabel can do that. I say if I'm Ohio State, you give him a blank check, say you bring in whatever staff you need and go from there.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, pie in the sky, Vrabel says no. I mean, you have to at least call Urban Meyer.
Yeah, I don't
As
disagree with that.
it sounds crazy, but I think Urban probably says no at this point. I think he's like 60 now in his early
Yeah.
60s, which is fine. But as we know, Urban Meyer is a maniacal man, and
Mm-hmm.
he pushes harder than just about anyone. But same issues with that. Transfer portal with him could be a concern. And then, of course, you mentioned Marcus Freeman. Obviously, had a great Ohio State career. Um, had some time in Cincinnati, so he's built some in-state Ohio connections already, which I think is critical for an Ohio State program.
Yeah.
And honestly, we've seen it when Ohio State played Notre Dame head to head those 2 years in a row. Despite the stark talent difference between the two, and I want to say the talent has definitely improved over the last few years for Marcus Freeman. But when
Sure.
they were head to
Sure.
head with Ohio State, Ohio State was the more talented team.
Yeah.
And Marcus Freeman nearly won both those games.
Hmm.
And they had what 10 guys on the field on that fourth and goal play, where they could have won that
Yeah,
game. And even the year before when he had just taken over, there was a ton of turnover for Notre Dame. They had a chance in that game too. So
they
I
did.
think I think I think if you give Marcus Freeman Ohio State's resources, and I'm not trying to discount Notre Dame because they're a playoff team. Obviously,
For sure.
they only have one loss this year, bad loss, but they have one loss. Um, Ohio State with Marcus Freeman could be something special too. And he's a
Mhm.
relatively young guy, and he's the type of guy who could be head coach there for 20 years or whatever that looks like. He has his
Yeah.
buddy,
You had
and
the success.
he has his buddy James Laurinaitis on coaching the linebackers already.
Hmm.
Um, Hartline's there. I think they were all on the team at the same time. So
Yeah, I think that's correct.
they're all Jim Tressel guys. They're all guys who never lost to Michigan. And I think between those three options, I mean, you can't really go wrong. So, but yeah, my first choice for them would be open checkbook, Mike Vrabel. Let's go.
Yeah.
Hire whoever you want. Let's get this going. But um, yeah, I think that's the next step if Ryan Day doesn't pull it out. And
Yeah, I
I
agree.
think they have the talent. I don't think they will, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And look, uh, when we were on our Twitter page, one of the accounts that we follow had tweeted out, like, I'm not closing the door on Ohio State and Ryan Day winning the national championship this year. And I had sent a response saying, I fully agree with you talent wise. Like you mentioned, like you can never be out on Ohio State year in and year out talent wise because the talent is there. They are one of the 3 to 5 most talented programs year in and year out on the field. But I was like, you've got to proceed with extreme caution when Ryan Day is the head coach because he has just shown an inability to get the most out of his talent and to actually overcome adversity and come out on top in those matchups where the talent is relatively equal. He just has failed in all regards. So, talent wise, fully agree with you. They might be one of the most, if not the most talented rosters that enter the 12-team college football playoff. But I would not feel better about them than like maybe 5 or 6 teams in that
Yeah.
postseason bracket, depending on what it looks like here at the end. Strictly because I don't trust Ryan Day. And after uh, this past weekend, I don't trust Chip Kelly either. Like they're a product of each other, and I do not have faith in them any longer. I don't think many Ohio State fans, alumni, former players, boosters do either. And their AD talked about Ryan Day's got our full support. That to me, the way it was worded was very much a blanket statement of like
Yeah.
we have to say this right now, but we're on the same page of like what happened Saturday was unacceptable. If we don't go on and achieve the ultimate goal this year, conversations will be had. Will a trigger be pulled? That is to be seen depending on what happens in the playoff because of that huge buyout and then the check you're going to have to write for the next coach. But I think the writing is on the wall. And I think Ryan Day can sense that truthfully, and would wish nothing but the best for he and his family if it ultimately does end up happening. And he moves on from the Ohio State head coach, of that historic football program. But the Ohio State bunch, similar to Alabama, Georgia, like they are a proud bunch. They're not a patient bunch when it comes to not doing what you are supposed to do historically. So it's going to be interesting to see. They'll be in the playoff field. We'll see how they'll do. We'll see if they're hosting potentially Tennessee or if they're going to Neyland Stadium. It kind of looks that way right now, but obviously we have to have championship weekend play out.
Yep.
So we'll do all those previews here at some point. We can also do the upcoming conference championship previews as well. But this was one we needed to talk about because there's a lot of fallout from this game. So to everyone, that tunes in and listens, thank you guys so much. Really appreciate you guys. Can't believe we're already through the regular season of college football here, but we've got conference championships and then the upcoming bowl games and playoff games. So really looking forward to that. Drop a like, leave a comment down below. Let us know your thoughts on this game. And then we'll check in with you guys in the next video.